welcome to the Spirit Box podcast. Today is a bonus episode to try and tempt you to come and join the higher tiers in the Patreon. Now, what I'm going to share with you today is some shows I recorded last year about the Fear Dubh Dorcha. Now, the Fear Dubh Dorcha is an interesting figure. Not a huge amount is known about it in kind of the broader folkloric landscape of Ireland, but it's quite robust if you do some exploration. Now, the stories I'm about to recount to you are stories that I found trawling through the databases at Duchas.ie, the Irish folklore online library, and it's a wonderful resource, and hats off to I think it's the UCD folklore team for putting that together. Some of these stories I translated from Irish, or Gaelic, I should say, albeit quite badly. However, you get the general gist. The Fear Dubh Dorcha literally translates as the dark black man. Now, it's nothing to do with race, it's more to do with the kind of overall kind of countenance and how the figure presents itself, this daemon presents itself. It's the dark figure on the roadside, the kind of men in black / old Nick type figure that people run into. Now, these stories are probably from the last century. They're part of the schools collection. They're part of some more generic folkloric collections. And they're really rich food for thought. Now, I know lots of my listeners will be familiar with Alan Greenfield and his book, The Secret Cipher of the UFO Notes. In that book, he talks about the Men in Black. And he talks about Malcolm X having an experience in prison, an encounter with the Men in Black in there, and the quote being, he had on a dark suit, I remember. I could see him plainly as I could see anyone I look at. He wasn't black and he wasn't white. He was light brown skinned, an Asiatic cast of countenance, and he had oily black hair. John Keel, Alan Greenfield recounts, gave his view of things in his book, UFO's Operation Trojan Horse. The records of demonology are filled with striking parallels. The general descriptions of the vampires themselves are identical to the Men in Black. The dark skin, the angular oriental-like faces were commonly reported. So there you have it. If you like what you hear, then come and join the Patreon, sign up for the higher tiers, and we'll get 2 shows out a month depending on your options. Okay, that's it from me. Now on with the Fear Dubh Dorcha.
It is a suitably dark and stormy night as I record this. So what I'm going to go through is some folkloric gems I've found in Duchas.ie, which is the project to digitize a lot of different Irish folkloric collections. And the principal bits I'm going to go through are a few taboos, portents, and evil eyes references rather. But more importantly, I'm going to go through as many references as I've found to the Man in Black. Now, the Man in Black is a particular figure that appears again and again in both fairy lore, but also in magical lore. Those of you who heard Aidan walk through the show recently on the podcast will be familiar with his experience with the Man in Black. But also, the same theme came up in Hellier. There's the same theme in kind of broader UFO myth. The same figure comes up again and again and again. So let's explore what the folklorists and historians have been able to gather from the rural populace of Ireland over the last 150 years. So these stories and anecdotes have been collected by various different folklorists working for the National Folklore Collection at UCD, University College Dublin, over donkey's years really. Part of this project is to digitize all these things, as I said, but also transcribe them, which makes them searchable. So I've been doing the bit of going through and reading all the references I could find in English to the Man in Black. I need to look for the equivalent term in Gaelic, which would probably be something like Fear Dubh, and then translate those pages and see what we find again. But you're going to see some very similar themes. It's the man in black, the dark stranger, the portent of doom, and it's got ties to a kind of a devil type figure, an old Nick, obviously, which is quite a common motif. But we'll come back to it again. We'll come back to the man in black theme again. But I would suggest after you listen to this, go back and have a listen to some of the Hellier shows we've done in the past with Marco Visconti and Lonnie Scott. And I think having those kind of fresh in your head will give you some food for thought. So this next story is from County Meath. One summer night, Bob Crosby and a companion went down to the Poorhouse Road as far as the bridge to fish. It was a lovely bright moon lit night, and Bob and his friend remained a long time fishing. His companion said, "I smell a cigar." But Bob said, "You imagine it." Then the man that smelt the cigar said he was going home, but the two put up their rods and started on their journey. They never spoke till they were long past the bridge, and the man that smelt the cigar collapsed in the middle of the road. When he got up, he said to Bob, "Did you see him?" "No," replied Bob. "See who?" The man that collapsed said that a man dressed in black was smoking a cigar and walking by his side, but Bob saw nobody. "Well," said his companion, "if I had given you a blow on the left shoulder, you would have seen him too, but I did not, lest you would be frightened." When the man in black had disappeared, the two men started to run, and they never stopped till they were safe at home in their own house. There you go. So the interesting thing is they're smoking the cigar because that's a sign of sophistication and wealth. And and the idea of being in a black suit, which you'll see will come up again as a theme, is well dressed. It's gentry, it's kingship, and that cigar is a kind of a sign of wealth and sophistication. It's an indication of kind of a devil type character. This next story is from Bridget Willoughby in County Carlow. One night a man was coming into Hackletown, and as he was coming along the mill road, he saw a man coming to meet him in black. The man kept meeting him, and as he came nearer, the man in black opened his coat, and the other man could see a ball of fire inside his coat. So he turned back his horse and he went home. Short and to the point there, but again, you get the kind of the magical element here. Interesting ball of fire as a symbol. Again, we get the idea of kind of orbs and ball lightning. Interesting connotations there. This next one is from Patrick Dermody, aged 80, from County Longford. Now, a lot of these references are transcribed, so they don't read particularly well, so my apologies if the flow is a bit clunky. There are also reference elements that are of local knowledge, so they won't always kind of make complete sense in isolation. They assume some local knowledge between the storyteller and the individual recording these stories. So this is a story heard. Patrick Dermody. Heard the following story from my grandfather, Mr. Patrick Dermody of Cluna, who was near 80 years of age. Long ago, there lived an old blacksmith named John Dillon, and he had a forge at the corner of the Dring Road. Beside this forge, there was a planting that belonged to the Dopping Heppenstalls. The planting was cut down, and it was said there was an evil spirit settled in it. And after the planting was cut, the spirit used to go out around the hill from nightfall to daybreak, roaring and shouting, and he used to roar at the blacksmith through the window of the forge. At first the blacksmith was terrified, and he never used to leave the forge because the spirit never came, only when he was alone. Someone told him to bring holy water into the forge and sprinkle it around. Then the uncanny noise began at the forge window. After a time, the smith got accustomed to the antics of the ghost, and he was not afraid to remain in the forge. When the shouting commenced in the window, he sprinkled the holy water all around the place, and he heard the spirits detest heated iron. So he used to redden a bar of iron and stick it out the window. The spirit immediately left from the forge window, but continued roaring around the hill where the planting was cut until daybreak. In a gate lodge owned by the Hebenstall family, there was another ghost that gave the people of the lodge no rest at night. A tall black man used to walk in the house at night and up the stairs into a room where no one could sleep in it, and it had to be left vacant. When the ghost entered the room, it made a great noise and appeared to smash all the furniture in the place. But when the owners of the house went into the room the next day, there was nothing broken or out of its place, and the room was in the same condition as they left it the night before. No tenant remained for more than a month in the place, and one day the landlord discussed the matter of the farm steward, who laughed at the whole story about the ghost, that it was the imagination about ghosts that must be a person alive who was playing tricks on the people, but that he would take a gun and remain in the lodge at night, and if any person were to come up the stairs, he would shoot them. The steward carried out this promise and remained in the lodge, but when he didn't turn up for work the next morning, some men went to the lodge and they found him lying senseless at the foot of the stairs, and his body was all black from the beating he got. When the workmen reached the lodge in the morning, they found all the doors locked, and they got in through the window. No outsider could get into the house to cause those injuries. The steward never fully recovered, and his mind and speech were affected until he died, but he was constantly saying, "The black man, the black man." So there's some interesting motifs in that, in both those stories. So you can see the same thing again in the latter story there, the idea of some sort of poltergeist activity, and the tall black man being associated with it, given the appearance of smashing things up, and then actually nothing's broken in there. So there's a trickster element to it, and then there's quite a violent element to it. The person who confronted the spirit, as they have a tendency not to like being confronted. Now, the first story there, the former one there, was talking about a forge. There's two things about this particular story that are interesting. So the planting was cut down and the spirit was settled in it, and after the planting was cut, the spirit used to go around the hill. So it's saying, the story is saying that the after this whatever transgression occurred, it freed the spirit, or the spirit was angry. It freed the spirit, and the spirit was free to roam. But you can look at it another way, and that actually it was a transgression that angered the spirit, and therefore the spirit reacted. So there's two things then in terms of what the blacksmith did to respond to this. So he used holy water around the forge to protect it, to act as defense for his place of work. Again, you can see it's talking about it from a Christian sense. The holy water is used as a barrier, as a preventative measure. Exact same thing in Islam with Quranic water. But then he said he heard the spirits detested heated iron. Now that's the first reference I've seen to it being called heated iron. But we're well versed about the revulsion that jinn and fairies are supposed to have to iron. So this is why this makes me think that this isn't necessarily a evil spirit, but potentially kind of fairy type jinn entity, because he's using iron to repel it. However, what these things are is up for debate. So it's, iron in its form could work for many different beings. So some interesting stuff there. Now the next story, John Grace, 78, from County Wexford. One night my grandfather was coming home from Torps, and as he was coming down the corner, he saw a big black dog and a man in black with a cloven foot riding on him. The dog was in his way, and he had a stick in his hand, and he was going to hit the dog when all of a sudden he got as big as anything and went down towards John Murphy's gate and disappeared. But my grandfather said the hair was standing to the end, that his hair was standing to an end at the fright he got. So it's pretty clear what the motif is here. Cloven hoof, fairly evident. But one of the interesting things here is that it was met along a road. One night my grandfather was coming home along a road in the night, and this is the traveling along the dark road where you're not supposed to be when you're in the liminal space of night. This is where these type of attacks and transgressions can happen, and it was generally a frowned upon thing to do this, to walk home at night, you were much more vulnerable to the attack of these kind of entities at those times, and hence why people brought, a piece of iron in their pocket or a piece of cinder from the fire to protect them from the she that might be about and with ill will. This next story is from County Wexford. There was a man coming from the public house, and he was always afraid in the night. Our friend came a bit the way with him, so he had to pass the graveyard alone, and as he was passing the gate, a man dressed in black ran out and caught him by the hand and looked in his face. The man had a beard which was very long and white as snow. The poor man was very frightened and almost fainted. The man walked with him. The man walked with him for a few yards till he found out it was a cousin who was blind and had lost his way, and went into the gate instead of turning the corner of the road. Well, someone obviously got the fright of his life there. Seems to be by an hour. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's some quite funny stories in there as well, which I think you might enjoy that one. Next story is told by a gentleman called Pat Ferris, and it's from County Kerry. A countryman was returning home one night from the Listowel Fair to his home in Gorta in a horse and cart. His horse was young and swift, and his owner drew near a field known as the Clover Field, a short distance from his home. A stile led into this field, and as he drew near, a strange man dressed in black emerged from the shadows around the stile, and in the twinkling of an eye was sitting in the cart with the astonished farmer. The horse got out of control and rushed off madly in a lather of sweat. It was almost impossible to keep him in hand. The mysterious stranger vouchsafed no answer to the countryman's attempts at conversation. "Good night. 'Tis a fine night, thanks be to God. Isn't it a bit late you're walking abroad?" To all this the man in black pursed a close silence, and upon reaching the bend of the road, the driver was petrified to discover that on turning once more to his silent companion, there was no one beside him in the cart. The pony immediately stopped, quivering with terror, but on being calmed and rubbed down, he resumed the former steady trot homewards. The man who had the strange encounter told the story to his nephews and nieces, also adding that there was a fairy fort in the Cloverfield, and very probably the stranger was from that spot. Now the next one is also from County Kerry, and this is an interesting story as well. There's bits of the Pied Piper of Hamelin in here. There's kingship over animals, and in this particular piece, kingship over vermin, which is interesting. Anyway, this is called Legends of the Lords of Lixnaw from County Kerry. The mansion and outbuildings, which were many, some of the remains still exist, and the place is called the Old Court, were at one time greatly affected with rats, and were found very difficult to exterminate. A strange man came along one day and offered to rid them of the rats. He ordered that the large building should be provided and fitted up so that no rat could escape from it. This was done, and the rat charmer, if such he may be called, went out into the courtyard, whistled a tune which had the effect of bringing all the rats from the surrounding houses and fields into the courtyard where the man stood. He continued the tune until all the rats were assembled around them, and then he marched them off into the house which had been provided for them. They all followed him into the house, and then he shut and locked the iron door so that no rat could escape. He received the reward he had claimed and went in his way. On the following day, a strange man riding a black horse drove into the courtyard and demanded the release of the prisoners, which he said were locked in the building. The steward said he knew of no prisoners, and the man in black pointed to the house where the rats were imprisoned and said he would rid them of all of them, at once demanding to have the door unlocked. This was done, and the man rode away with all the rats at his heels. This next story is from County Sligo, told by a lady called Mary Marin. Once upon a time there was a young man who was going to get married. His mother and sister would not allow him. They started fighting, and they used to be fighting from once they would get up in the morning until they would go to bed at night. This day there was a neighbour coming along with his cattle. It began to make a heavy shower. A man dressed in black passed him. He spoke to him, but he got no reply. He kept before him until he came to the house where they used to be fighting. The man with the cattle knew them well. He put his cattle in the street. The man dressed in black went into the house before him. When he came in, he asked where was the man who came in before him. They began to search the house, but they found no one. They got afraid and told the priest about it. The priest was not go because he knew it was Satan. They went to the bishop, and he told the priest to go. The priest came and began reading and sprinkling holy water. The man in black came in and went down to the room. The priest kept reading and shaking the holy water. At last the man came up out of the room. He went to the door, and he spat a ball of fire out of his mouth, and it set fire to the jambs. He disappeared in the flames. This next story is called Finds of Urns near Kilmuckridge, and it's told by a gentleman called John Dempsey, age 65, of County Wexford. In the townland of Kilnacooley, in the southeast corner of this parish, there is a house and property belonging to a man named Mr. John Keogh. About 45 or 46 years ago, several burial urns were unearthed. They were of various sizes, some quite small, but others as large as a basin or a can. In the same field there were also found graves of stone, and these graves were the remains of humans of huge size. Some years later, when the roadmen were removing the road metal to use in the adjoining roads, other urns and human remains were found. The local idea was this was an old pagan burial place, but until the discovery above was mentioned, there was never any local tradition of its existence. The only thing that did fit with its discovery was the universal belief that this district was a bad spot at night, that it was surely haunted. Weird noises and unearthly cries were heard by the residents of the district. These noises were said to resemble nothing so much as the tramp of men and the clatter of horses' feet. An old man of the district who saw one of these graves actually describes it as follows. At the bottom was a huge stone or flag, and the skeleton of a man of extraordinary size rested on it. On the four sides were other large stones or flags, and on top again was a huge flag large enough to cover it all. It was just like a coffin made of flags of stone. Compared with an ordinary man's skull or shin bones, they were out of all proportion. There are many stories to the extent of the haunted atmosphere that still pervades the place. A headless black dog, a woman in black with a hood thrown over her head, are heavily storied in all the yarns of this word spot. There are several residents in the area, over 55 years of age, who solemnly state they've seen strange lights and have heard weird noises. One point is worthy to mention here is that everyone who's seen this ghost quite agree in the description of a tall man in black with his head bent low as if he were looking for something on the ground. They also fully agree in the account and description of a hooded woman, and all agree to the correct location of the apparition. I have from an old resident of the area that some of the urns found lately in this spot were taken away by the Reverend Dr. Ransom, a native of this district, who is, by the way, an authority on matters of folklore. I have also heard from Mr. John Carberry of Litterbeg that Reverend Dr. Ransom, Professor of Greek, etc., in St. Peter's College, Wexford, took away for safe preservation the cross of the old church at Kilnacooley. He is also reported to have recovered an Ogham tablet at the old castle at Dundrum, which, by the way, is reported to have been a very important ecclesiastical centre in the old days. It is stated that the bishop once had his see there. The next story is from 6 Mile Bridge, County Clare, told by Patrick O'Mara, age 70. There were 4 men coming from Michael Kean's house one dark night. They had to cross 3 fields. When they came out of the house, they went as far as the ditch. They saw a man in black and they said good night to him, and they got no answer, and they looked back and they saw nothing. They were frightened. Their names were John Cooney, Jimmy Ford, Tom Parnell and Patrick Collins. There was no one in it. They saw a light in the house and they heard crying inside, and then when the door opened and it was the banshee that was crying, the house was haunted. They went on and the banshee followed them, and they had to pass a wood. They saw a light in the middle of the wood. The light was Jackie the lantern, and when they went near it, it disappeared all of a sudden. They did not go to Michael Ken's house or cross any more fields, across any of the fields. Well, I wouldn't blame them, in fairness. They saw Satan, a banshee, and the jack-o'-lantern all in the space of one night. That's quite an evening, gents. The next story is County Meath. It's from County Meath. This reference is the Summerhill Ghost. James Riley of Clunymeath was coming home from Enfield one night driving sheep. He sat up in the cart to rest himself and jogged along. Coming to a lonely place near Summerhill called the Moy, he was amazed to see the sheep suddenly stop. He got down and looked about him, and suddenly he spied a tall man in black standing at the side of the road. He said good night, but got no answer. Immediately the man disappeared. The sheep went on as before, but just then James knew that he had seen a ghost. So you can see the same motifs here again. The man in black appears to create a disturbance, doesn't engage, and then immediately disappears. This next one is from County Cavan, by James Montgomery, age 65. There are ruins of houses that remain to this day in instance, old ruins of castles, schools, and houses. There are ruins, I'll just read that again, sorry. There are ruins of houses that remain to this day, for instance, old ruins of castles, schools, and houses. In the town under Drumbay, there is the ruin of an old school. In our land, there are old walls standing now. A lone man was living in this house, and his ghost is said to have haunted the place, and anyone who would toss those walls would have ill luck. A story is told of a man who long ago was going to make a briar of it. He was building it one night, and when he went to leave, something caught hold of him, and he could not move. He was terror-stricken, and he tried to move again, but he could not. He was held fast. He looked around, and he saw a man in black keeping a hold of him. He begged the ghost to let him free. The man went home, but he never came near that place anymore. Okay. So they're a collection of references and stories that I've managed to find going through the Duchas records. As I said, I'll go through and find some ones in Gaelic and translate and see where we get with that. But again, it's interesting, the same motif again and again and again. And it turns up in modern folklore, in modern kind of paranormal conversation. And as I said earlier, Adrian Wachter mentioned it in his appearance on the Spirit Box podcast. He spoke to his direct experience with the man in black. So I think this one I'd like to discuss with you a little bit more, so please leave your comments in the Discord and let's chat about it. Let's hear what you guys think this is. Now, before we wrap up this show, I'm going to read a few more bits that I found that are quite interesting, which are a reference to portents and the evil eye. So the old people very frequently referred to the good people, and many still exist who would tell stories relating to them. And we all know what the good people are, right? Pat Egan from Drumdareglan, some 50 years ago, was going to Australia. In those days, they walked to Dublin, Drogheda, etc., to whatever port they met their ship, and carried their meagre wants tied in a handkerchief. Generally, they started at night. Anyhow, poor Pat was trudging a mile or so when he met the good people carrying a coffin and asking each other who will be in the coffin next. Answer Pat Egan if he goes on the ship. Pat returned home with a fright and heard later his ship was drowned. Matt McCabe, Drummond told me quite recently that when he was a boy, he was sent riding a horse for the doctor in the middle of the night up at Rosson, and he met such a crowd of boys and girls as he thought that he scarcely got past. They made a pass for him, and as he passed they sang, but when he got to the end of the file he was unable to proceed any farther. Another man who appeared to come up on his track saw nothing but helped revive Matt and go with him on his journey. The old people who believed that if news the good people brought was for good to the person whom they appeared, they or their signs would appear in white, or as white sheets spread in the path, white lights appearing in the distance, all good omens. On the other hand, black dogs, black clouds, etc., evil omens. Now, interesting stuff there. The premonition that they gave, the portent that they gave poor Pat Egan. And again, he's starting his journey at night. This is when these things happen. And then Matt McCabe sent riding for the doctor in the middle of the night, and he meets the good people, and they prevent him from going any further. And that's an interesting thing because there's a few bits going on there. Obviously, there's the shock of the experience that he has, and that he's somehow frozen. He can't pass any further. So there's an element of kind of lost time there, and he has to be kind of revived, or brought back, to get back on his journey. So again, there's some kind of weird type things going on there that would be very reminiscent of abduction experiences and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not going to go there in any detail. That's a big one. But I think the other little bit that I wanted to kind of talk to in that one, which could easily be missed, is these beings, by obstructing someone going to the doctor to help somebody, are being quite destructive and malicious in their mischief. And that, I think there's something to that as well. You know, that level of disruption and interference, kind of needless interference in human lives. And that's where a lot of the real fear of these things comes from, particularly in Irish culture. It's just this seemingly randomized disruption that doesn't end well. You know, that fairies or the good people can have quite malicious intent, seemingly needlessly. Hello, people. How are you? So this week we're going to pick up where we left off from the Man in Black research into Duchas.ie. So I looked for some Gaelic terms and found some Gaelic transcriptions as well, which I've duly translated, crudely, I might add, into English. But I'm going to read some of those stories to you now. But first, I think it's worth just unpacking a bit the actual terms. So there's the Man in Black. So I searched for that term off the back of some of the witchcraft shows we had, most notably with Aidan Wachter. But it was also that Man in Black harked back to some of the ultra-terrestrial work that I was doing, or shows I was doing earlier in the year and towards the tail end of last year. And that theme came up in Hellier about the Dark Man, the Man in Black, and that kind of was tied into the character of, or the entity that was Indrid Cold. Now, obviously, the Man in Black figure is famous in culture for being Men in Black, that being the weird alien, the weird characters that come and clean up after alien encounters and alien sightings and visitations and abductions. But the actual figure, the motif of that figure goes way, way back. And the thread that I'm pulling on is obviously the Irish folklore one. But I think there's a couple of other bits to it that you can tie together. Potentially that there's a couple of things going on here, but I think that ultimately what's been described in these essays or these transcriptions is the kind of devil trickster figure. But what did come up in here is the Fear Dubh or Fear Dubh Dorcha is the exact phrase that's used. There's two things with it. There's basically is it either a villainous druid, a evil sorcerer that attacks Finn McCool and his wife Saiva, and he is also described as a malevolent fairy who is the who kind of does the unpleasant work of the fairy queen, like snatching people away. So we'll talk to that another time, but there's definitely a motif there. You start to look at things like the Shadow Man, you start to look at things like abductions, and the motifs start to kind of double up there. Now that could just be total circumstance and the broad sweeping of these themes, the broad strokes of these themes. But there definitely seems to be something there. Anyway, I'll unpack that at another stage when we go through the Fear Dorcha. There's a multitude of spellings, all which I'll put in the next show notes when we go and have a look at that in a bit more detail. Right, so on with these particular stories, and then we're going to do a little bit about seals, or more importantly, seal folk, the Selkies, the therianthropic figures of Celtic and Norse myth. So let's get into our first one. So this one is from County Waterford, and it's from Whale on Corrin on Rin, from a lady called Koch ni Corvilta, aged 41. There was a man long ago, and every night he would go to a house near him to spend the night. This one night, when he went to the house, no one was inside, and he wondered where all the people were. He went into every room, but saw no one. He went out into the cattle pasture and saw a big black man standing in the middle of the cattle pasture. He became frightened and was going home when the big black man ran up behind him and knocked him down. The black man told him not to be out late any other night, as he himself would be watching him. The next night, the man was out again. The black man saw him and killed him. Now, what we need to be wary of here is that the phrase black man does not mean a person of African origin or at all. It's talking about someone who is dressed in black, has the appearance of black. So it's more of that kind of dark fairy figure. It's not referring to anybody of African extraction rather. But so here you find something strange. So the one night he went to the house, nobody was inside. So some sort of liminal thing is happening, and he's warned not to come back or not to go out at night. And if he does, he'll be in dire straits. And he did. And he got killed, which is a very common theme with fairies, as we spoke before about this thing in the last one of these, or previous one rather. Don't do the thing. The fairies warn. The protagonist does the thing and pays the price. And that is generally how that story structure goes. This next story is from James Mulready from Clare. About 50 years ago, my grandfather had a workman named Pat Mullins. He used to go on a circuit every night to the neighbour's house. One night as he was returning, he saw a black man sitting at Knocknashallow Gap. He saluted him, but instead of replying, the black man came out of the gap and walked by his side. Pat got afraid and went into a neighbour's house owned by a family called Carey. When the Careys were about to go to bed, Mullins got a bad weakness. Annie Carey went for the doctor, who took him to the hospital, where he died about a month afterwards. The black man was never seen again. This one's from County Waterford. A working man was smoking, and the man in black asked him for a piece, but the workman said he didn't have it, but he did have a big piece, i.e. piece of tobacco. The black man disappeared. On the morning of the day after, the workman could not get up. He was in bed for a month. No doctor could find a cure. When he died, some people saw him crossing the same fields. The same thing happened in the old community some years ago. Again, transgression against the man in black ends in a fatality. This next story is called Nadini Moch, which means the good people. We know what that means. This is from County Clare. There's a small wood about half a mile from our house. It is said that the good people are there every night. There was a man in his cohabitation near the place, and he wanted to see the good people. One night he went to the woods to see them. No one was in unison with him. When he was near the woods, he heard something inside the woods. After a while, he saw a black man riding a white horse. He had the horse dressed beautifully. He became frightened and he ran home. When he was going home, another man met him. He told him the story of the good people. He said he wanted to see them too, so the two of them went into the woods again. When they were near the woods, they saw the black man riding the white horse again. When he was near them, he stopped and started talking to them. He asked them who they were and where they lived. He was asked where he lived, and he stretched out his hands towards the place where he lived, and they looked back towards the place for a while. When they looked again at the place where the black man and the horse were, they were gone. The black man and the horse were never seen again. Now that's, again, another recurrent motif, the idea of the Dark Rider. So it's a certain theme that this character turns up again, is riding a horse along the road. That's either a beautiful horse or the fastest horse. But sometimes these people who meet the Dark Rider in this particular form, they meet him along the road, they get challenged to a race which they will ultimately lose. But it's tying into that kind of idea of the wild hunt as well. A man was playing cards one night, and it was around 1 o'clock when he was coming home. The black man hit him on the road. The man became frightened and not surprised, but the man in black said, "Be here at this house for tomorrow night so that I may kill you." The man went home and his anxiety burned. The next day he went to the priest and told him what he had seen the night before. The priest remembered himself for a while, and at last he said, "Get peat and light it around you, get a chair and sit in it, and have a bottle of foot water in your hand. And whenever the black man tries to catch you, the water will blow out and he won't bother you." When night came, the man did as the priest commanded, and the devil came to him and said, "Come out here to me that I may kill you." "I will not come out," said the man, "like you would kill me." Then the black man tried to jump in to catch him, but failed. At last the town's cock crowed, and the black man said, "Get home now." "No," said the black man, "my own cock has not yet cried." And in the end his own cock crows. "Go home now," said the black man. It didn't call," said the man. Then the devil leapt in to try and catch him, but the man blew the water out of him, and the devil knew that he'd been defeated, and he threw sparks up in the air until the man went home safely. Now, you can tell that it's quite a clunky translation, which is why it doesn't read very well. So my apologies if that's unbearable to listen to. But that's the selection of stories that I've found that are in Gaelic on this particular resource. Now, they are all copied from rural people over the last 100 years. So they're literally as they would have been told. They haven't been polished in any way. They're transcribed straight from these folklore collections. So I mentioned when we were at the start of this program, start of the show rather, about Fear Dubh Dorcha, or Fear Dorcha, and how he had some interaction with Finn McCool. So the most common story is the one where Fear Dorcha is looking to have Finn McCool's partner be his wife, Saiva, to be his wife, and he transforms her into a deer when she refuses his advances. Now they rectify it, and they get into kind of a lot of issues, but I'm not going to go into that too much. But we'll visit at another stage. But I'm going to talk to a short piece that I found here. Now, I don't know the actual theme of the story. Again, it is tricky to translate. I'm sure some of you might know actually where it is, but the piece that I want to read to you is the very start of it. Now, Dinian in Gobar told me the story. She was born and raised in Laharbreach, and I heard the story from her father, Brian McGubber, and he spent his life in Laharbreach, and he heard the story from his mother, and she spoke no English. Fianna Era was one day hunting in the mountains of the Glens. So Fianna Era is the group of elite kind of heroes of Finn McCool. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Irish myth cycles, the Fianna were the kind of I guess very similar to kind of the Knights of the Round Table of Ireland, and Finn McCool was very much the kind of the hero, the leader, and in some way he's kind of like an avatar of Lug Love Father. So he's got that Lou kind of power, except he's clever. You know, he's very, very clever, and uses a lot of his skill in kind of outmaneuvering his enemies and in the various different tricky episodes he finds himself in. Anyway, I won't go into this story in too much detail. I want to find out a bit more about it before I read it to you. But the first bit I want to go through is just this opening paragraph. Fianna era was one day hunting in the mountains of the glens. A great fog came over them and they went astray. They sat down, and the dark black man came in through the mist and had a batch of green apples with him on the palm of his hand. He gave one of them to Gull MacMorna, and Gull said it was the best apple he'd ever eaten. Then he gave another one to the Fingalians, the Fianna. The dark black man said if they went with him for a day and a year, they would get plenty of those apples. Gull MacMorna said they were ready, and they travelled flat. Right, and then it starts to go and quite weirdly talk about Belgium, and there's some sort of fight against the Belgian Fianna. As I said, I'm not really going to go into that bit until I figure out what that story is actually about, because it's a bit gibberish. But that opening paragraph that I just read is obviously got fairy tale motif after fairy tale motif, but it's not just the fairy tale motif of like, here's this weird witchy apple and you're going to come away from a year and a day, which will obviously be a year and a day in fairyland will equal centuries in this land, but it's the figure coming through the mist. They get lost in the mountains, so they get lost in some liminal space. The mist is that portal, and they go through the portal and they meet the man in black, and the man in black ushers them into some place on the promise of these apples. So there's a huge amount going through there, you know, but ultimately it's an abduction story. They take them away. There's time distortion, and this mysterious figure whisks them away from the mountains. So that's an interesting piece when you look at it from that angle. It's the similar motif again and again and again. I quite enjoyed actually re-listening to some of that stories. It was just actually dawning on me that the whole idea of the gift of apples has a quite Garden of Eden feel to it, and again kind of locks in the Fear Dubh Dorcha to Iblis and Satan in that regard, which is unsurprising, but interesting. So these bonus shows are for the higher tiers. Now there's only 3 tiers, so it's not particularly confusing. But yeah, if this sounds like your bag, then come and say hi, and hopefully we can catch up and discuss the Fear Dubh Dorcha on the Discord. Take care and talk soon.